Hello, everybody. Welcome here to the panel session, Protecting Professionals in the Public Sphere. You know, this event is a chance to show connections between key freedom of expression concerns in the cultural, journalistic, and scientific communities. We live in a time where all professionals who live and work in the public sphere come under increasing threat. So this event will both present recent ongoing research projects in these thematic areas, as well as panel bringing together perspective from all three sectors. But first of all, let me please introduce you our UNESCO Assistant Director General for Communication and Information, Dr. Tawfik Jelassi. He is responsible for the organization's programs on building inclusive knowledge societies, leading digital transformation, strategizing the role of ICT in education, and fostering freedom of expression. Please, Dr. Jelassi, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, good evening to all of you and welcome to this session on protecting professionals in the public sphere. This is obviously an integral subtopic of our World Press Freedom Day and Conference here in Punta del Este on journalism under digital siege. At UNESCO, it has been many years that we have developed collaborative work across different programmatic sectors of the House. Today, you will hear from my colleague Ahmed Zaouche, coming from the culture sector, and I am, as the moderator said, from the communication and information sector of UNESCO. So the work has been spanning not only different sectors of the House, but also working with member states and with different partners on this, obviously, interdisciplinary and interagency piece of work. The theme of this year's conference, Journalism Under Digital Siege, very much reminds us of the threats that journalists face due to advanced digital technologies and tools and the ever-evolving ecosystem due to digital transformation and the proliferation of ICT-enabled solutions. You may know that UNESCO has recently, a couple of months ago actually, published a new flagship World Trends report on freedom of expression and media development, which has identified many worrying trends happening in this domain. Obviously, we see an increase in online violence, online hate speech, speech of extremism, but also we have been seeing major threats happening online against women journalists. Our studies show that 75% of women journalists are subject to online harassment, and in 20% of the cases, that is 1 in 5 women journalists end up being physically attacked. What starts online moves to the real world and the physical space. This is one of the worrying trends that I wanted to mention. Of course, this statistic and what I mentioned about the freedom of expression of journalists goes way beyond journalism. And that's the topic of the panel this evening. It goes to other creative professions, to artists, to scientists, to educators. And we have seen this in many contexts, the least of which is the COVID-19 pandemic, where, of course, there was misinformation and disinformation about the effectiveness of vaccines, and also very much doubting the testimonies of world-renowned researchers and doctors and the scientific authorities. So I want to say that what we have done for more than 10 years to preserve the freedom of journalists and to foster freedom of expression has moved to other professions like the ones I mentioned. And this is where the collaboration across sectors takes full sense. What have we learned from 10 years of the UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity for crimes committed against journalists? What have we learned that could benefit other sectors, other professions? This is clearly all about freedom. This is all about how to combat censorship. This is all about how to address issues of impunity for all those who attack people's freedom to create, to educate, to research, to express, to bring verified truth to the rest of the world. Obviously, these professions have been subject to a lot of pressure, not only state censorship, but sometimes non-state actors who have been putting pressure, sometimes have been interfering with the job of these professional workers. It is also the freedom to access cultural work that challenge very much the predominant existing ideas, as I referred to. How can we ensure that journalists and the other professions I mentioned could continue safely, securely do and exercise their professions to the benefit of all of us in society? I think this is one of the questions. We don't want to see these journalists being intimidated, pressured, and we don't certainly want them to be shut up, because, of course, that will impact society in a very negative way, but more than society, it will impact our democratic system in which we live. So obviously, we have to make sure that educators, as an example, continue to disseminate knowledge, to share information. And I am one of those. I have been for 30 years as an educator before joining UNESCO. So we know that if you cannot preserve what we call knowledge-based society, what will be the future of societies? So this is, as I said, a very important issue as we see. And I'm very happy that the permanent delegation and mission of Denmark to UNESCO has led an effort from their side as a member state. And of course, today, they are going to present, and Malene, Mansour here, is going to present Critical Voices, which is a flagship publication made by the Danish permanent delegation and mission to UNESCO, which, of course, she will speak on eloquently later on. There is one conclusion I would like to share with you. An attack on one is an attack on all. Keep that in mind. An attack on one profession is an attack on many other professions. If we don't speak up, if we don't stand united to fight these harms I mentioned a series of harms affecting different professions. If we don't do that, then we know what will happen. First of all, a shrinking of the civic space. Number two, of course, we'll see erupting conflicts. Number three, we'll see democratic backsliding. And all of this, of course, will very much challenge the viability of these professions going forward. It is for these reasons that I very much welcome this intersectoral and this interagency work that UNESCO has been doing, but also reaching out to member states and permanent delegations of UNESCO. And as you know, we have 193 member states. So the road ahead is quite a long way. I mentioned one member state, which we value a lot, Denmark. But of course, we want to expand the geographical scale, but also the type of impact that we can have. I mentioned the work in the sector I'm in charge of, the communication and information sector, on freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and the safety of journalists. And you may know that this year we are celebrating next November the 10th anniversary of the UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity for crimes committed against journalists. Of course, our work here will lead up to some of the conclusions and some of the recommendations that we can share on November 3rd and 4th in Vienna, since the government of Austria has kindly offered to host a high-level ministerial event to celebrate this 10th UN anniversary. We need to come together to compare what has worked, what has succeeded, and what has failed, and also to hopefully converge on what still needs to be done down the road. As I said, fortunately, we won't be starting from scratch. Fortunately, we have a solid base on which we can build. I think the recognition of UNESCO in the field of freedom of expression, safety of journalists, as we have seen yesterday, with a tremendous visibility given to our global celebration here in Uruguay, but also the granting of the UNESCO Guillermo World Press Freedom Prize that happened yesterday afternoon, when I saw the subsequent media coverage of your sessions, of the deliberations, the panel discussions and the like, this gives us confidence that we are maybe making some progress on our advocacy work, because all starts with advocacy. All starts with awareness creation or awareness raising. And then we can take it from there with the actions that hopefully can have impact on the ground. Let me conclude by saying that we welcome very much your remarks, your inputs, your questions, which will certainly inform our policies, decisions, and future initiatives and projects, especially dealing with emergency situations, conflict zones, and crises. And obviously, we dealt with this ourselves in a humble way. We dealt with the crisis in Afghanistan last summer. We are dealing with the crisis and the war in Ukraine as we speak. So UNESCO has, in a humble way, a track record on not only the safety of journalists in stable democratic societies, but how about in war situations, in crisis, and in emergency contexts, like the two countries I mentioned. Let me here very much stop and conclude by saying UNESCO and similar UN agencies are not talk shops. They mean action on the ground. They mean impact on the ground. We are not here just to make speeches. We are here to inform our policies in an inclusive, multi-stakeholder way, and that's what we do with our member states, in an inclusive, multi-stakeholder. Why multi-stakeholder? Because we believe we are a node in an important network. The leaves of the networks are public sector, with the governments, with the member states, private sector. Today, I had meetings with Facebook, with Google, with others, the digital platforms, civil society, academia, research institutions. It's our responsibility to reach out, to initiate a dialogue that hopefully will lead to some recommendations that we could then translate into action in the field. So the time has come to act, and this is my call for action going forward. I think I will stop here. You know, the danger with the former university professor, that he or she does not know when to stop. I want to stop because my colleagues have interesting things to say. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, dear IDG. As you said, what have we learned? And I think that now Malene Nielsen Mansour, deputy at the Danish delegation at UNESCO, is going to share us some knowledge of this Critical Voices report.
Thank you very much. How do I do this? Like this. Thank you very much, and thank you, ADG, for a very powerful statement. Very, very powerful. And thank you for inviting me to present the report, Critical Voices. This one. I'm very glad for this opportunity to discuss how we address the worrisome trend of a shrinking space for professionals to express themselves freely, because that issue is our burning platform and rationale for producing this report. As a UNESCO delegation, we wanted to explore how we, within the field of UNESCO, can make a modest contribution to help counter disproportionate restrictions on freedom of expression. UNESCO's freedom of expression mandate is clear. At the same time, UNESCO has a special responsibility when it comes to the rights of professionals. Professionals constitute a group at risk simply because their work often goes against established views or official narratives, or because they develop new ideas and insights that might disturb or expose problems. This is what we wanted to address. This is our motivation for embarking on this journey of writing a report. Before I go into sharing some of the key findings, I will share some of our reflections that explain why we have chosen to focus on what we focus on in the report and the way we structured the report. So UNESCO has instruments that are very pertinent and very relevant for some of the key challenges that we have today. I remember one expert said it very clearly to us, it's a treasure, but sometimes often a hidden treasure. With this report, we wanted to raise awareness and collect knowledge about the UNESCO instruments. And we wanted to explore what these instruments can tell us in terms of obligations that states have to fulfill. We also wanted to explore how the instruments can be utilized by us and by stakeholders. What do we know about how these instruments are implemented? What mechanisms do we have to hold states accountable? And what mechanisms do we have to engage in dialogues on specific issues on freedom of expression for these professionals? The UN Secretary General's call for fuller use of the UN human rights system guided us in the sense that we wanted to see how UNESCO system connects with other parts of the UN system, and in particular, the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council. We have dedicated a whole chapter on this question because we see a strong added value if we manage to combine UNESCO's normative instruments with the Universal Periodic Review, because that way we will not only stress that member states have obligations, we will also be able to use this innovative platform of the Universal Periodic Review to hold states accountable to these obligations. A last point before I will share some of the main findings in this report. UNESCO's work on freedom of expression has been our main source of inspiration. The UN Action Plan on Journalists, the engagement with the Universal Periodic Review, the condemnations of the killings of journalists, the request to member states for information, and the training on the international standards for freedom of expression. This is just to mention a few of the good practices that we've mapped out and which has inspired the 25 recommendations that are also in our report. Now let me share some of the key findings of our report. First of all, there is a worrisome tendency among governments to misuse critical moments, crises and emergencies to further restrict freedom of expression. In Chapter 1 of our report, we document how COVID-19 has led to restrictions on freedom of expression for both journalists, artists, and scientific researchers. The chapter outlines the international rules telling us that some restrictions may be justified, but in most cases, these restrictive measures taken by governments are disproportionate and very hard to justify. To avoid a new normal with additional restrictions, the report recommends that the international community monitor the rollback of such COVID-19 measures. A second finding, UNESCO has adopted a number of specific legal instruments which clearly outline that states have specific obligations when it comes to professional groups, and you have them here. So states must both help and sustain an enabling working environment. States must ensure that professionals are accorded the necessary protection, and states must respect the professionals' right to freely organize themselves in unions and professional organizations. So the findings tell us that journalists, artists, and scientific researchers constitute professionals at risk. They face many of the same challenges of freedom of expression, and they share many of the same rights. But what they also share is the same possibilities to turn to the UN system. UNESCO's reporting frameworks provide some transparency around questions such as how states fulfill their obligations. The Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council provides an opportunity to hold states accountable to these obligations, and also to engage with stakeholders to address specific issues at country level. For instance, when national laws may contradict international standards or they do not comply with the UNESCO instruments. So a key question for us has been how the Universal Periodic Review currently addresses the related freedom of expression for professional groups. First, a few numbers. So we have 193 member states who have all agreed to submit to a review of their human rights situation with regard to their laws, with regard to their policies, and regard to practices. As of today, a total of 80,000 UPR recommendations have been issued to countries, all with the objective of improving human rights situations. 60,000 of these recommendations have been accepted by the member states under review. All member states are receiving and accepting recommendations. No country is perfect. Every country can do better. Around 2% of the accepted UPR recommendations pertain to the freedom of expression of either journalist, scientist, or artist. And most of these recommendations either call for or often also provide concrete guidance on measures to improve the freedom of expression situation in a specific country. Our reports zoom in on those 2%, and very few UPR recommendations address the situation of artists and scientific researchers. Only about 20 recommendations on scientific researchers and 23 on artists. As I mentioned in my introduction, UNESCO's work on freedom of expression for journalists has been our key source of inspiration. UNESCO has developed guidelines that clearly explain to stakeholders how they can engage in a universal periodic review, before, during, and after a review. The objective is, of course, to maximize efforts and to seize opportunities for tapping into discussions on possible new law reforms in areas where the government have already committed. So keeping that in mind, our report points out the following. Increased stakeholder submissions to the Universal Periodic Review may help raise awareness about the challenges for professionals. Member states will make their decisions on what to recommend and what to accept, always keeping an eye, of course, on diplomatic relations. Impunity remains a major challenge across regions. This is due to a lack of political will, weak institutions, and slow-moving courts. At the same time, the accepted Universal Periodic Review recommendations, they also reflect that governments will commit or have committed to improve that situation, and we need to explore that. There is a degree of competition also between the specific various human rights challenges. Civil and political rights have often attracted more interest than the economic, social, and cultural rights. And it has been recommended that artists be included in the approaches related to journalists, and we do see signs of that already. For instance, we see some joint civil society submissions that cover both journalists and artists. And in addition, we have a country, Sweden, who has established a national mechanism that covers the safety of both artists and journalists as part of the UN Plan of Action. So, bottom line is that the various stakeholder groups have to play their respective roles to make the best of UNESCO's instruments and the Universal Periodic Review. Our report provides a total of 25 recommendations, and a good number of these recommendations deals with how stakeholders can engage with the Universal Periodic Review. And there is a new cycle of the Universal Periodic Review that will start in autumn. So we have a good momentum to actually prepare well for that. Earlier today, I participated in a closed-door meeting exactly on this topic, and many of you are here today again, and it's nice to see you once again. All your insights that you provided has helped us somehow get an idea of how we can engage together in the upcoming Universal Periodic Review. So I've presented some of the findings in our report. I have hard copies for those of you that have not received one yet, so please do not hesitate. Also to visit our website or write me an email if you want more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Malene. Let me introduce now Ahmed Zaouche, Program Manager at UNESCO Cultural Development Program. He's focused on UNESCO 2005 Convention on the Protection of Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, and he's going to share with us the results of the UNESCO study on protection of artists and journalists in emerging contexts. Ahmed, the first was you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ADG. It's really a privilege to be with you today. I'm really delighted to share the preliminary findings of this new intersectoral study on the protection of journalists and artists in emergency context. Could we switch to the PowerPoint? So indeed, as you know, as the custodian of the 2005 Convention, artistic freedom is very important for UNESCO. This is a new concept. Global reporting has started only in 2019. And we have, and this is an interesting concept actually, because it entails not only the freedom of expression, but also a wide bunch of social economic rights. And during the past years with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have documented devastating effects on the cultural sector, cultural workers. But in addition to that, there has been large scores of reported instances of violations of artistic freedom around the world. FreeMuse estimate that there is 20% increase in 2021. And those violations are particularly exacerbated in conflict contexts where the scale and the severity of the threats are higher and affects a larger number of people. So there was this will to really see what we can do in emergency contexts. And we had feelings and comments from some observers on the ground that maybe artists today in emergency contexts are equally threatened than journalists. However, they don't enjoy the same level of protection, and there's an opportunity here to try to expand the experience that UNESCO has gained in protecting journalists in conflict and non-conflict context to the artist sphere. So this is really the objective of the study. The study is ongoing. It's really trying to enhance the understanding of the legal and mechanism, but also the assistance networks available to both artists and journalists in emergency context. In the same time, trying to reconstruct the key milestones in UNESCO's work, supporting the implementation of the UN Plan of Action, and trying to understand what are the challenges and the opportunities to expand very concrete mechanisms in emergency contexts from the journalist to the artistic spheres. And beyond this, I would say, this advantage, trying to see what kind of alliances and synergies could be further built for each professional group to take advantage of the contribution of the other. So what is surprising, in the same time, not really surprising, is that artists and journalists are indeed are sharing the same challenges, sharing important same challenges. They are prosecuted under the same laws. They are attacked by the same state and non-state actors for touching on the same issues, basically. They are sacked from their job, their online presence is taken down, and they are subject to self-censorship, particularly in the case of increased digitalization. We have also tried to pay attention to the specific challenges shared by women journalists and women artists in terms of online harassment, difficulty of relocation in emergency program, and also a wide range of abuse and threats. They are often more targeted by extremist groups, and they are less comfortable expressing their opinions, especially for artworks dealing with controversial issues and taboos. So although those two professional groups share the same challenges, they have very different levels of attention, recognition, and support. And this can be explained by a number of reasons, maybe the concept of artistic freedom, that is somehow newer, but also the fact that art is often seen as a play, as an entertainment, while journalists are seen to have a vital mission to tell the truth, to make authority more powerful and accountable. And there is a lack of understanding, really, of the key role of artists for society, for challenging assumption, questioning norm, driving change and conversation that can lead really development processes. So in addition to that, of course, we have less organizations specialized on the ground in monitoring the situation of artists. They are under-resourced, they are fragmented, and they don't have that growth and maturity that organizations dealing with the journalists have on the ground. So another element that is important to highlight, indeed, is that there are also culture organizations feel less comfortable engaging on issues related to human rights in fear of losing income. Most of cultural institutions are receiving income from states, while journalists have more independence. There is also a lack of understanding of within human rights organizations on a specific issue of the culture sector. So, and usually human rights organizations tend to focus on civil and political rights and less on economic and cultural rights. So those different levels of intentions translates indeed in different differences in terms of instruments, differences in terms of international normative instruments. We have nothing equivalent to the UN Plan of Action for the Safety of Artists. There is no UN-wide strategy for artists. There is a high recognition for journalists and artists generally not considered as a priority group within humanitarian relief programs. Those differences also translate in the monitoring and the research and the coordination capacity on the ground. Fewer organizations indeed are carrying out monitoring. There is also a lack of expertise in some regions. We don't have really expertise with the dual background in human rights and culture. We have also lack of connections, or I would say disconnections, lack of different practices and terminology between human rights organizations and art organizations, in addition to the fact that artists are not organized within, like the journalists. They are less structured, and usually institutions do not lobby, cultural institutions do not lobby for artist safety. Those differences also translate in the relocation patterns. This is extremely fundamental. When we consulted with artists in Ukraine and Afghanistan, they have all mentioned that protecting livelihood and ensuring relocation should be the priority. And there are, of course, different approaches. When you relocate a journalist, you don't ask a journalist to share his book and portfolio of articles, while for artists, you ask an artist usually to justify that his artwork is valid and is of good quality. Of course, there are less and fewer opportunities of relocation for artists than for journalists. They are not suitable for emergency. This is a very time-consuming process. It's very much relying on cities, and this is not something that needs to be reconsidered. So looking, of course, differences translate also in terms of national legislations, where we are very proud and happy that more and more states are enshrining artistic freedom in national constitutions and coming up with new laws on the status of the artist. There's still an important disconnect between law and practice. So in 1 minute, maybe looking ahead, what can we do concretely? And this is something important to consider, because when you speak about emergencies, speaking about an emergency in Ukraine or Afghanistan, those are totally different situations. So it's important to have responses that are tailored to the political context. There is no one-size-fits-all. We need to invent new assistance patterns for journalists and artists in each single context. It's also important to distinguish the phase of emergency. Are we speaking about a core emergency, a pre-emergency with mitigation, or with post-emergency interventions? And then in terms of priority, what has been suggested by the interviewee, the artists and journalists themselves, is to establish a permanent structure for monitoring for artistic freedom violation and also killing of artists, getting inspired maybe by what is being done for journalists, like an observatory. This is something of importance. And also, another element of importance is to secure not only the livelihoods of artists in emergency context, which is something we do in many countries for journalists, but it's also securing artworks collections and supporting the continuation of cultural activities in the countries. And this is something we can maybe put in parallel with the UN Plan of Action for the Safety of Journalists. We support communication institutions to protect their integrity and safety, and we need also to support cultural institutions to maintain cultural expression in times of conflict. Another element of importance is building further the capacity among artists and journalists on the issue of safety. Safety training are important, and there is a need to enhance skill. To be more specific, other avenues of potential synergy and joint interventions, it's important to work with the judicial and legal actors to collect cases of jurisprudences on artistic freedom and there is a lack of jurisprudence in artistic freedom. The only database is with Columbia University, and this is something important to build the case, to train lawyers, to come up with more jurisprudence in this field. Important to have a joint capacity building to member states to revise law, to implement them. And it's important to have creative advocacy events. We have been doing advocacy events, you mentioned this, Malene, this morning, since maybe 2016. The culture sector, the communication and information sector have joined forces, and we had artists and journalists on board. But how we can really create and innovate in the advocacy events we carried out, having both state and non-state actors, and focus really the advocacy initiatives on specific case studies. This is something that was suggested, and last but not least, support really the elaboration of UN-wide and maybe EU instruments. As you know, the European Union is also a member state of the 2005 Convention. We are also discussing with EU networks to see what kind of declaration, statement, or framework could be set up to provide emergency funding and support to artists and journalists at risk. We will continue this work as part of the UNESCO Ashburg program, that is the new operational arm of the 2005 Convention in this field. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ahmed. Very clear and strong. And now I'm going to change to Spanish and call for the stage the second part, the panelist. Bueno, por favor, Cecilia Noce, coordinadora del proyecto de...
Please, Cecilia Noce, coordinator of the project of CADAL, of liberty, freedom of expression. Lino Prada, founder of Agenda Propria, is an agency of journalism co-created with CURSA that focuses on indigenous subjects and minorities. And online, Rafael Radi, Dr. Rafael Radi is the director of the Center for Biomédicas Investigation in the University of the Republic and president of the National Academy of Science in Uruguay. As you can see, a representative of the three sectors are engaged in this dialogue today that is being threatened in their public participation. So it's important that all of them can have freedom of expression. So, Cecilia, I will start with you. I have some questions here. I will follow my script. What is your opinion about how the different stakeholders can join to protect the freedoms of artists and cultural workers? Sorry, but I tend to speak too much. So first, I am here as part of civil society. I'm not an artist, and I will tell you what my basis is in Latin America, the region where I do research. I work in a project between CADAL, that is a Argentinian NGO and a Swedish NGO, and we analyze the attacks to artistic activity against artists in Latin America. We have recorded 23 assassinations in the last years. We recorded tens of threats in Cuba. We have 70 artists were arrested, and we heard of tens of artists exiled in Ukraine, Afghanistan, and we know the tragedy of Venezuela and the loss of their cultural system. In Nicaragua, with the displacement of artists, last week 4 were expelled, and Cuba is also using forced exile as a form to attack art freedom since the beginning. So taking into account who was going to be present in this panel, I started to think what we could do in our roles in the context that we are working. And I thought of 3 objectives. First, for prevention. We need the violence and the attacks of art expression in Latin America to come down. And in that sense, we can work first in the concept of art expression freedom as itself, because we haven't so far. If we talk about freedom of expression, okay, but art freedom of expression, then people don't know what we talk about. And And the third objective has to be do with action. There are few with us and not enough is being done. About prevention, thinking about the roles of each one, I thought that we need to work and to legitimize and test the concept of art freedom. And UNESCO and other bodies have a paramount role in working with this and to provide visibility to this concept. And the journalists and the academia can also collaborate in this. The work of the academia, I think it's very important. They need to take this concept and make it operational in their research, not only in culture, but also in political science, in international relations, disciplines that are far somehow from the cultural world, that start to work about this concept. It's a good concept to think of autocratization. We need to, in order to create indicators, we need academia to join this project.
We need to improve the way of denouncing these aggressions and violence and limitations of freedom of expression. And there need to be special meetings with artists where we can hear firsthand their experiences and the way in which they have been marginalized or attacked. I think we need to create these spaces and generate a way of denouncing these situations of breach of their rights of freedom. And then NGOs need a greater way to express this. There needs to be a network that is efficient and working. We need this network to create a greater response and a faster response. Journalists are our greatest allies. We need the freedom artistic expression needs to be protected and covered by journalists. When we see we see how sometimes the attacks on freedom of expressions are reported as something not serious, and we need the collaboration of journalists to cover this with the seriousness that is necessary. We need to be more efficient in a sense. We need help from academia to have a greater collaboration from academia and independent use of tools and instruments that are available from the different organizations. We need review of methodology and databases and how we are measuring these events. We need NGOs to generate actions and have campaigns that are visible and, of course, more creative. And we need international organizations, regional and national. We need to detect what's going on in this continent and detect our crisis. Latin America needs to be visualized, and we're very glad that Ahmed has mentioned creativity, because it's something that needs to be put into action so that we can live and be victorious in the crisis that Latin America is going through. Thank you, Cecilia. Now Edilma will speak from her perspective as a journalist working and reporting on indigenous populations. What is needed to cover security for journalists? Firstly, I'd like to mention that through Agenda Propria, the media that I represent, we want to promote a new way of working with indigenous populations, and this is a collaborative work. We know that there are indigenous journalists in Latin America, and this is important because often in the large media we don't consider that the indigenous journalists are actually doing journalism. And so our company, we are looking to promote and defend their line of work of indigenous populations and indigenous journalists. We have united because traditional media has not covered adequately the situation of indigenous people. There is discrimination information is often erroneous, and there is often information that is not accurate regarding indigenous people. So we need to change the view and how we see and how they see their worldview and their beliefs. And our media, we are trying to promote and respect about Mother Earth more than just informing about environment issues. There are many things. The World Organization recognize the Mother Earth term, but we need to discuss this in a more respectful way about the reality that indigenous people are living. Finally, regarding this collaborative journalism and cultural journalism, we want to improve our way we work, where there is a lack of voices of indigenous people. Most of indigenous people's stories and pieces of news, their reality is a partial biased view. It's just the official view, the government's view, the military, but there isn't, the indigenous people's voice isn't expressed. So we need to start addressing this, and indigenous people is adding their voices, mothers, women's, the wise women, witch doctors. We need to consider them official sources of information in this population. And this is the reality that is often faced by indigenous journalists, and it's the issues that we have to see. Just today, we talked about how the word is at risk. 2 weeks ago, 10 indigenous journalists, we united in the triple border between Brazil, Colombia, and we saw that there is several issues that need to be seen. We need to discuss how our media covers these issues. It's not the same as an indigenous journalist covers their own issues from the on the ground. We can see it in many places. However, in what goes on in indigenous grounds is crime, trafficking, exploitation, legal and illegal exploitations of the environment. COVID, it has caused the death of many of the witch doctors, many of the last speakers of indigenous languages, and this reality has not been reported. This is a reality that is being lived by indigenous people in their indigenous reserves. There are many indigenous people in this region, and these situations are at risk, and it's creating a elimination of indigenous knowledge and indigenous people. And I'm from Colombia, and there's 115 different indigenous people groups, and only from 2004 that we had because of the conflict, there's a risk of extermination of 64 of those groups. Out of 115 of those groups, over 50 of them are a minority group, and only 10, they have less than 30 people left. So there's an extermination of these people, and the traditional media is not covering these issues that are placing at risk the life of these people and these communicators and journalists from these indigenous populations. There's also a discrimination issue. Those of us who work reporting on these issues, we have suffered discrimination because we work covering these stories. And in spaces such as these promoted by UNESCO, we need to be participating. Indigenous journalists need to participate, need to be invited to share these spaces so they can show and talk about, create a space where indigenous artists, indigenous journalists can come together and be invited to share their worldview, and including and recognizing their important jobs and important role. It's something that will show a greater respect for their voices, and they are communicating freedom of expression, and something which is very important. If a indigenous reporter or a indigenous reporter or journalist, it's something which is very, very serious for the whole community of indigenous people, and this has not been valued. And so we need to understand that this is a network of indigenous reporters and journalists who need a greater protection and support. There's also a lack of technology in indigenous reserves. They are often in the great areas of poverty. There's often no electricity, not even we're trying to use solar energy a lot more to be able to give access to technology. And so from the ground, those reports can be, from the ground, one can share those stories. But it's a slow process. Slowly, the different platforms are arriving, but it's still not enough to be able to inform from the ground what's happening. And finally, I would like to invite you to follow the process that we are creating through Agenda Propria, and we are trying to produce journalist creation and content. So not only crimes stories, but also talking about indigenous languages which may disappear, and also issues regarding to children, ancestral knowledge, and all these different issues which are important and valuable for culture and the artistic world. These are culture, these are people who need more information, who need to be have the light shed on them and what's happening in their communities. Thank you, Edilma. And now we're going to hear from Professor Rafael Radi, especially in the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you think has happened regarding security for scientific researchers? Thank you, Guillermo, and greetings to everyone who is there. During the pandemic, I was the coordinator of 60 researchers. We created an assessment board for the government during a 15-month period. And for many of us, it was a challenging experience of communication with society. And there were certain moments which were difficult with regards to giving a counseling the government and with these sensitive issues. Often scientific evidence was taken to be functional for the government, or if it was elements that would destabilize the government. And we had that happen in both directions at different points of the pandemic. And some of our national researchers had certain levels of attack and threats, which for many of us were unique experiences throughout our career. Normally, science is valued in the general public discourse, but when science is starting to become something more of our daily life, such as climate change, such as how a pandemic is managed, there are certain voices that challenge the possibilities of working and expressing our work and our discoveries and research. I think there have been certain institution and organization that allowed us to work in this council and assessment group. They responded slowly to these process, and I think that for the future, the main, a greater involvement of the scientists in the public agenda needs these institutions and government and non-governmental organizations be involved. If not, there is a risk of the quality and quantity of scientific guidance that can be given, and this is going to limit public guidance. Thank you, Rafael. I think it's quite clear that appearing in the public sphere has certain risks, especially when the message isn't that which is expected by receptors of the message. We've seen over the different sessions today that in journalism there are many more risks, as it's not yet there's a lot to work on, and much more in those which haven't been yet included in these artistic artists and certain scientists who've been included in this panel. I think we could leave this place feeling sad about everything that we have left to do, or we can be happy because there is many occasions such as this to start to explore possibilities and what needs to be done. And we saw how also there are certain institutions which are working so this reality changes. And this is something that I think is very interesting for us all, because it's something we'll all do together. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And also, I forgot to say that there is an artist who's been drawing the experience. So thank you. Sorry, I hadn't mentioned it previously. I just remembered. Yes, he will later share his art with us. Thank you. I hope you have a good evening. Thank you.